kind of confusing. It is not. We believe that God is. We believe that God exists. In plain pattern, we all believe that God dead. But we don't really trust His word. We don't have any confidence in His saying. We believe that God dead, but we don't believe what God said. And we see that in our everyday lives. There's so many things that we do. And I said last week that we should not find it very strange. Because even some of the greatest Bible characters, men that we hear about, and men whom we have read about in the scriptures, who sometimes had doubts in God's word. They did not have confidence in what God says. Abraham and his wife Sarah were like that. They were without children for many years. Abraham was 99 years old or 100. His wife Sarah was 90. And Abraham was now bawling and crying that he was going to die childless. And a stranger in his house would inherit everything going on. Can you imagine that you wait, and you don't get no opinion, and the caretaker get everything when you get there? And he was not so happy about that sister now. And so God promised him a child, and he was 100, and his wife was 90, and them laughed. And said, we don't think that can't even happen anymore. You know? And God says, well, I'm going to tell you that you see next year this time, it is going to happen. And these were people, Sister Etta, who were God's people, who God had spoken to and interacted with in their lives. And so it is with us, who are God's people. And we have interacted and experienced so many things in our lives, yet at a point we have doubts. We talk about Moses, who was like that. God had showed many great miracles before Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. Rods turning into snakes, Moses' rod swallowing up snakes, God sending all these plagues on the land of Egypt, parted the Red Sea, Israel passed through on dry land, the Israel and the Egyptians drowned, coming behind them, and they saw all these great works. They were led out into the wilderness, they were thirsty, water flowed from a dry rock, and they all drank. And then he allowed cornmeal to fall from heaven, that the people could get up each morning and gather and cook as they like. And then they started quarreling that we tired of turning come, we want meat too. We want meat too. And God says, all right, I am going to provide tomorrow meat for everybody in the camp. And Moses says, meat for everybody in this camp, when we have 600,000 men, not counting women and children, and you say you're going to provide meat for everybody. So here was a guy who had seen all the wonderful works of God, and yet he still doubted. And so it is with us. You know, that we too have our doubts. I'm not talking about people in the world who are not God's people. You know, the Bible is addressing those who belong to God. That there are times in our lives that we're going to doubt so many things. We're going to doubt whether or not we are lost or saved. I've heard somebody ask, if you should die right now, would you be saved? Lord, leave it up to God. We don't really know, but we should know that we're saved. You know, so don't affect all of God's people. And so this morning, as we read this other version of the Matthew 17 text, if you notice, it talks about this boy who just in born dumb and deaf. Can't hear and can't talk. And full food too. And so he had this kind of spirit that had possessed him. And the father came to Jesus and says, I brought my boy to your disciples and they could not make him better. Now in the Matthew 17 text that we looked at last week, the blame seems to have been placed on the disciples of Christ. Because the Father says, I brought him to your disciples and he couldn't make it better. And then when Jesus made him better in Matthew 17, the disciples asked, how couldn't we do it? And Christ says, it's because of your lack of faith. You didn't have any faith. But if you notice now in Mark 9, Jesus addressed the Father's lack of faith. And Jesus says, if you believe, then the boy can be better. And he says, Lord, help me to overcome my unbelief. Help me to overcome my unbelief. So as Christians, we have our doubts about so many things in our lives. Whether it's a persistent illness, whether it is something that is aggravating us, whether it is wanting to achieve, whether it's a job, and so often there's so many things that we want to be realized in our lives, and we say we don't think we can realize. We don't think that these things will ever happen on our husband. But boy, I don't think it can happen. No matter why, I don't think, or will this guy ever marry me? I don't know. Or will this girl ever marry me? I don't know. Will I ever get out of this stress and anxiety and depression? The guy said, Lord, help me to overcome my unbelief. Unbelief has a lot to do with doubt. That we don't really think it can happen. I told you about the lady last week. It's just a story that lived underneath a mountain. And so she couldn't see a sunrise. Only when the sun was in the middle of the sky, on any given sunshiny day, she could see. And she would pray every night for the Lord to remove the mountain so that she could experience a morning sunrise. And every morning, when she woke up and she opened the window, the mountain was still there. And her remark was, just as I thought. Just as I thought. In other words, she was praying, Sister Mar, but she wasn't believing. She was praying and she was doubting. So I do not know what may be bothering us, what may be our challenge. But sometimes we pray and we don't believe. We just pray, but somehow we don't say anything about work out. You know, but we don't say anything about work out. That is what we call unbelief. That is doubt. And so, like this father today, I'm going to be asking all of us, including myself, as Jesus said in the Matthew 17 version of the story, this kind of faith to get things done in our lives without doubting only comes through prayer and fasting. So we have to pray, and you hear this, how this boy's father in Mark 9 says, Lord, help me to overcome my unbelief. And I believe that most of us here today, Sister Etta, if not all, are sometimes in our lives been doubtful. We have told ourselves that there is no way